name is Brantley Barrow, and I'm the Emeritus Chair of the Terry College Alumni Board, and it's great to be with you this morning. I'm filling in for Dean Ben Ayers, who has had another commitment over in Athens today and could not be with us. I want to thank you for being here. As y'all probably know and have heard in the past, Terry Third Thursday is actually an event that's put together by a committee of the Terry College Alumni Board, this year headed by Zach Deming and 8 other alumni board members. It's a monthly breakfast event, and it's based here at the Terry Executive Education Center, which is set up as the base operation for the Terry College in Atlanta. It's also home to our Executive MBA program, which is ranked number 8 in the United States, number 14 in the world, according to The Economist. That's pretty good ranking. So let's give the Terry College a round of applause for that. Of course, we couldn't do it without our sponsors. We have a corporate sponsor, which is Bank of North Georgia. And we have 2 media sponsors, which is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and Public Broadcasting Atlanta, WABE. Let's give them a round of applause for their support. I want to let you know that this is our last Terry Third Thursday for 2015, as we will not have an event in December. However, we will resume in January. On January 21st, we have David Cummings, a partner with Atlanta Ventures. On February 28th, we have Alex Taylor, who's an executive vice president at Cox Enterprises. And on March 17th, Mary Lassinger, chairman of the board and CEO of Veritiv, will be with us. So please come out and support those upcoming events. Also, Dean Ayers is getting ready to go around and present an economic update in 10 different cities around the state of Georgia. And I think he even goes up into North Carolina, doesn't he, Jen? Did he go outside? All in the state. Okay, so he's in 10 cities. One here in Atlanta is going to be on December 11th, so I'd encourage all of you to attend that event. And you can find more information on the Terry website, which is www.terry.uga.edu. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce this morning's speaker, President and CEO of the CDC Foundation, Charles Stokes. I've had an opportunity to get to talk to him a little bit, and he tells me he thinks he may retire in 3 or 4 months. He's at the tail end of his work career, but he's probably going to stay involved in a lot of different activities after he retires, so congratulations. The CDC Foundation's goal is to do more faster by creating partnerships between CDC and others to fight threats to health and safety. Charles joined the CDC Foundation in 1995 as executive director and is now its president and CEO. Under his leadership, the foundation has grown from a staff of 2 to a team of over 100 professionals who manage around 250 public health programs in partnership with the CDC. Prior to joining the foundation, Charles worked with the Missouri Department of Health, serving as deputy director for the department for 1983 through 1995. He has accumulated many years of service in the fields of public health and public administration, both at the state and national levels. He was president of the Missouri Public Health Association and the Missouri Institute of Public Administration. He's currently vice chairman of the Atlanta-based Raoul Foundation Board. He's chaired the American Public Health Association's expert panel. He's a member of the Staff Advisory Council to the National Governors Association's Task Force on Universal Health Care. He's a board member of the Public Health Foundation. He's an editorial board member of the Journal of Public Health, Management and Practice, and he's a current member of the Advisory Committee on Public Issues for the Ad Council. So you're staying pretty busy, I'd have to say. That's great. He's received many accolades during his career, including the Noble J. Swearingen Award for Excellence in Administrative Management, the Public Health Leadership Award from St. Louis University, and the Atlanta Business Chronicle's Healthcare Heroes Lifetime Achievement Award. He graduated from St. Louis University, has a master's degree in education from Lincoln University, and an honorary doctorate of law from the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. Charles's topic today is harnessing the power of partnerships. So please join me in welcoming Charles Stokes. Charles.
Well, thanks, Brantley. It's a real honor for me to be here. Georgia has a tremendous university system, and the University of Georgia is just absolutely the shining star in that system, in my opinion. And the Terry College of Business is, of course, a key and important part of that college. So it's an honor for me to be here to be able to talk to you this morning. I want to do several things. I want to talk a little bit about my early years and kind of how I came into leadership and management. Unlike many of you who have the privilege of being associated with the Terry College of Business, I did not have management training. And I think it was Will Rogers who said, I have good judgment, and good judgment comes from experience, which comes from bad judgment. I have good judgment. And so I want to talk a little bit about myself and some of my early years that led to some of the philosophies of management that have worked for me over the years. Then I want to talk about the CDC and the organization that I started and have run for the last 20 years, the CDC Foundation. And then I want to end by talking about what I think was one of the biggest health threats that any of us will see in our lifetimes, and how the power of public and private partnerships worked to come together to beat back this deadly disease that was a threat to all of us about this time last year. So let me get started. As I said, I didn't start out as a manager. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family, and the dream of every Irish Catholic mother is to have a son who's a priest. So my fate was cast. At the age of 14, I left grade school, traveled 600 miles to a seminary in Columbus, Ohio. And I spent the next 7 years going through high school and 3 years of college. And most of that time, I had my eye on one prize, and that was to become a Catholic priest and become a missionary to Peru. And somewhere along about sophomore in college, someone drew a picture for me and explained celibacy to me, and my mouth dropped open. And I thought, you know, I'm not sure I can do this. And so, interestingly, the church was in transition at that time, and we were really moving into a much more open era. But I chose to speak about my concerns to a spiritual advisor who was a tremendous guy, who didn't follow the model of the church at that time. When I said, I had doubts, his answer was, well, go home and date this summer. You've never dated, from the age of 14. You need to get out there in the world and decide whether you want to become a celibate Catholic priest or you want to become a married person. And so I did that, and actually dated several women, but worked with a lady who is now my wife of 43 years. And we have 3 kids, and it's been a wonderful career. But all that happened because of his encouragement to me, which was out of the box at the time, to say, get out there and live life a little bit and see what you want to do. Otherwise, I could have been a very unhappy person in a job I really wasn't cut out for. So I left the seminary. I went to St. Louis University, thought I might teach Spanish, tried student teaching, and within several weeks I realized that was not my career. But luckily I ended up working one summer for the government in an organization called the State Reorganization Commission, or the Little Hoover Commission. A lot of states had these in the 60s and 70s, looking at how to reorganize government to be more efficient. And I met several people there, one of whom, after I graduated, recruited me to the governor's budget office, where I learned a lot about how government works, how politics works, and a lot about budgeting, and started to learn a little bit about management. I also worked under two different bosses there with vastly different management styles that I'll talk about in a minute. So that was its own experience. So I got married. I graduated one weekend, got married the next. My wife graduated the next. I started to work for the budget office that summer, and a month later, I had a low draft number at the time, and I was drafted into the Army Reserves. And so I ended up going away to basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana in 107-degree heat in August. And again, it was a learning experience for me. The difference in the way people motivate and are motivated. So let me talk about some of the management philosophies that grew out of my experiences in the seminary, in the military, and in this governor's budget office. In the seminary, as I said, the lesson for me there was it's often and most of the time possible to do the right thing for an individual and for the organization. The right thing that my spiritual advisor did for me and for the church at the time was to say, you need to go date. He could have said, you know, look, the reigning philosophy at the time was, you know, keep your eye on the prize. Dating's not for you. So it is possible, and I think quite often we think that decisions for an individual might hurt the institution. I think that's a rare case. In the budget office, I was actually hired by a wonderful gentleman who'd been an elected representative for many years and then moved to the budget office. Had a wonderful management style, very supportive. Then I went away to the military. When I came back, there was a new director. This guy was, he was an interesting character, very smart, very bright. But after I'd worked for him for 3 months, I really wasn't sure when I was going to be fired, to be honest with you. He would emphasize what were the problem areas. I remember he would yell down the hall, "Stokes, get down here, what are these numbers about?" And so eventually I ended up being recruited to the health department and kind of fell in love with public health. But on my way out, I learned an interesting thing. He had to give me a service rating, and I'd worked for him for about 8 months. He rated me like 99 out of 100. He said, I really hate to lose you. That was such a surprise to me. And I had another friend who was recruited to the Department of Agriculture and left too. And we both talked about how, you know, clearly this guy doesn't think we're doing much for him. And he did the same thing, rated him outstanding, fought to keep him in the organization, fought to keep both of us. So there was a disconnect there. And the take-home message for me in terms of a philosophy of management was, if you think somebody's doing a good job, tell them. You know, I mean, we're human beings. We all have insecurities. We all need to hear how we're doing. And interesting dichotomy of management styles in those two people that I work for. When I went into the military, it was going through a transformation into what they were calling the new army. I think they knew they were moving eventually from the draft to an army that did not include a draft, and they were going to have to treat people differently. And so I went into an organization, a battalion with 3 companies, and 2 of them were traditional army. And the method in the traditional army was one of tearing a person down and negative motivation. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen that's bad. And I saw it demonstrated over and over. There was a young man in my battalion who I happened to be walking past one Sunday. His mother was there with him visiting. And one of the drill sergeants in one of these 2 old Army companies dropped him to do push-ups in front of his mother in 100-degree heat in his dress uniform until he dropped in the dust. And I was in my particular company, they were trying out a new philosophy. And when we went in to sit down with our drill sergeants, they said, look, here's the deal. you need to be the best company in this unit. And if you are, we can be wonderful to deal with. If you're not, we can be just like the other two companies. Your choice. And so we had a competition one day where we just blew the other two companies away. And the drill sergeants and the other ones were saying, if you don't perform, there's going to be KP, there's going to be no leave. Our captain got us together. He said, look, if we win, it's going to be beer and pizza I'm buying. Totally different management philosophies. And we just blew people out of the water in every competition. So those were management lessons that I really carried into my early years in the Missouri Department of Health, where I worked for 20 years after leaving the budget office. And I'll just say there that it was a great organization. During my time there, we grew into what I think was, and many people said, were one of the top state health departments in the country. We moved, after a 7-year battle, we won a legislative battle to become a department-level organization. So we did well there. But really, the most fun thing I've done in my career was moving to Atlanta to start the CDC Foundation. And I want to talk a little bit about first the CDC and then the CDC Foundation. I don't think people in this country really understand CDC. Those of you in this room probably do a little bit more because it's in our backyard. But it was a learning experience for me. I thought I knew them. I'd worked for them from a state level for many years. But I met early on with an elderly statesman from the Pan American Health Organization Foundation that I met with. And he said, Sonny, which I took as a compliment. I was, I think, 45. Do you really understand how the CDC is viewed in the world? And I said, well, yeah, I think so. I mean, they're viewed very highly. He said, let me put it to you this way. If you give any minister of health in the world a problem they can't solve and one phone call to make, it will only go to one place. It'll go to the CDC, not the World Health Organization or any other health organization. That's how highly they're respected. I heard the same thing from Bernie Marcus, who was our third board chair for the foundation. After a little bit of exposure to CDC, his take on it was, these guys, their work is too important to be considered government. They really ought to be franchised all over the world. So it's a tremendous organization doing everything they can to protect us from health threats. They have a single vision, and that is to protect Americans 24/7 from threats to health and safety. And whether diseases start in this country or abroad, or curable or preventable, chronic or acute, whether they're naturally occurring or terrorist in origin, it's CDC's job to track them, find ways to fight them, and empower organizations around the world to do a good job. So they've done that for many years. Along comes the CDC Foundation in 1995, which I started. We were Bill Foege's idea. And Bill was a famous CDC director who led CDC's fight to eradicate smallpox from the globe. And Bill is just an amazing individual. But he had a vision. And his vision was that as good as CDC is, as great as they are, they cannot do their job alone, that they could do so much more in partnership. And he felt there ought to be a not-for-profit private foundation to build those bridges between this government agency and the for-profit sector and the philanthropic sector. And so the CDC Foundation was created 20 years ago. And in that time, we have raised over $620 million. We've implemented, along with CDC, more than 800 programs in more than 75 countries around the world. And I want to talk for a minute about this whole issue of public-private partnerships that we're in. When I started in government in the 70s, in the budget office, this country was a different place. There was lots of money, lots of profits being made in the private industry, rapid growth, and there were some slow times, but things always took back off. And we're not there anymore. I think it's a flatter world. As a country, we're in greater competition with other countries around the world. Tax bases are weaker, And we need public-private partnerships to be successful. And the words flow off the tongue easily, but it's not easy to do. It takes a lot of work. I heard a professor at Harvard, a course I took one time, talk about this partnership business between government and it's like bringing together two wheels. You've got business spinning at this speed in this direction, and you've got government spinning in a different direction for many good reasons at a slower pace, following rules and regulations that you and I as citizens expect them to follow around purchasing and hiring and contracting, all of which have to be followed but do slow them down. And the CDC Foundation sits right at the juncture of those two wheels, absorbing the friction and trying to make things work. That's what building public-private partnerships is about. And there are some lessons, I think, that I've learned along the way as I've built the foundation up to be this group of amazing staff doing so much good work facilitating CDC success. One of the and I want to talk about some of those lessons, and they've come from some amazing teachers and in the form of some amazing board members. And I'm going to throw out some names here, most of which you'll recognize. Pete McTeer ran the Woodruff Foundation in Atlanta until just a few years ago, a sage guy. Doug Nelson is our current board chair, ran the Annie E. Casey Foundation and built it up as the foundation of the founder of UPS over many years to be one of the most highly respected foundations. So they were from the not-for-profit sector. Many business leaders have sat on our board. Bernie Marcus, Oz Nelson from UPS, John Rice, vice chairman of GE, Dave Ratcliffe from Southern Company, and Richard Edelman from Edelman Global Public Relations, now Edelman PR. And then from the governmental sector, we've had David Satcher, who was a CDC director and went on to become the Surgeon General, and Bill Foege, whose idea we were. And so there's some lessons that these great teachers have given me that I think have worked over time. And I'll talk a little bit about how we applied some of them in the fight against Ebola. One was focus on your mission. When I started the organization, Pete McTeer had me meet with the head of the Atlanta Community Foundation. He said, you're going to be asked to do a lot of things. There are no other foundations against which to benchmark this new space of building partnerships between government and the private sector. So figure out what your mission is and stick to it and promote it, sell it. So over time, that mission evolved into what you heard when I was introduced. We help CDC do more faster. More than they can do as a government agency with the restrictions they have, and more than they can do with just their government funding when we bring in private resources. But the faster is equally or more important. We bring the flexibility of a not-for-profit organization. When we raise money, if it stays in our bank and CDC directs us how to spend it, we can move with the speed that became extremely important when Ebola broke out in West Africa. Bernie Marcus, Marshall Hahn, who was another who had been CEO of Georgia Pacific. Many people have said, Charlie, hire people who are smarter than you. And what I would add to that is, and then listen to them, right? And I've worked in organizations, I think some of you have probably worked in organizations where there are smarter people sitting around the table, but they all know that their job is to agree with whatever the boss says. I don't believe that works. I think you need a diverse group of ideas around a table that need to be debated. And it's important for me to listen because every person on our executive team at the foundation brings a different set of experiences and for a particular problem is going to have the best answer. The third is stay flexible and adapt. And this was brought a lesson learned with hard knocks over time. I mean, you know this in the business world. The terrain's constantly changing. And what breeds success today does not tomorrow. And over time, we've had to change from just taking CDC's unfunded federal requests and trying to sell them to the private sector, which didn't work, to taking neatly packaged ideas from CDC scientists and trying to sell those to the private sector with almost no success, to understanding that we need to find people for any issue that we're concerned about, and this is the magic of partnerships. Find where we're aligned around a mission, and don't bring a preconceived idea. Bring everything that the CDC's got to throw at that problem, and everything that the Gates Foundation or United Parcel Service might have, and then develop what the best approach is, and that served us very well. I want to end by talking a little bit about how this power of public partnerships played out with Ebola. If you go back to the summer of 2014, the world was really under siege and being threatened by what could have become a disease that became certainly endemic on the continent of Africa. And as we saw briefly last fall, a threat in this country, to the point that every time you walk into a doctor's office, the first thing you're asked is, have you been to West? Where have you traveled? And Dr. Frieden saw that evolving in a trip to West Africa last August. And he came back and sounded the alarm loudly to the president, to the World Health Organization that was there, but maybe not moving quite fast enough at the time. He said, and CDC's modeling showed, that if something wasn't done and done quickly, there could be 1 million people affected and who would develop Ebola. And that's a scary statistic, because we were talking about an area the size of the states of Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. And if you think about it, between August and about January, essentially, almost 28,000 people caught Ebola, and more than 11,000 people died. We were getting reports of 500 deaths in a community like Atlanta in a week. Entire families wiped out over the course of a couple of months. And so it was in that scenario that Dr. Frieden turned to the CDC Foundation and said, look, we're going to deploy people to fight this disease. And over time, CDC deployed 2,000 of your friends and neighbors, most of whom volunteered to leave desk jobs and go over and fight Ebola, along with another 800 that supported them in this country. But he said, I can pay their salaries, I can pay their travel, but when they get there in this extremely undeveloped country, they have no way to do what they need to do. We need resources, we need lots of resources, and we need them fast. Every day we take to plan is a week we've lost in the battle to knock back Ebola. So he asked us to activate what we call our Global Disaster Response Fund, which generally sits empty, and we have to raise money for it. And we usually raise money by writing grants and proposals and sitting down and developing timelines. And so I lost a lot of sleep thinking about this challenge. The most we had raised to fight, for example, Katrina, our respond to the earthquake in Haiti, was about $5 million. And it took us several months to raise that money. We needed lots of cash fast, and so we had to adapt. We had to think differently, and our approach changed. We ended up talking to our supporters who gave us a little bit of money early, people like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We said, can you bring your friends to the table? You know us, you trust us. Bring other people to the table. We got on phone calls with donors, and people stepped up. I said, we need in-the-moment, on-the-ground funding. We need to fill gaps and make things happen immediately, and I can't tell you what we need money for at this point in time. We knew we needed, according to Dr. Frieden, in each of the 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, we needed to build emergency operations centers that were permanent war rooms where everyone who was working on this disease could come together, share ideas, hear the same information, and then act as one. So we took that on, and then there were many other things that we took on. But we had people step up when we asked for this kind of money. Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan wrote us a check for $25 million and posted the gift on Facebook. It almost brought it slowed our website to a crawl because people all over the country started donating money. And there were no strings attached, and still aren't, to those dollars. He said, use it to fight Ebola. Paul Allen and through his foundation stepped up and said, he heard me talk about, and Dr. Frieden talk about the need for these emergency operations centers, and 30 minutes later called back on a Friday afternoon and said, we're interested in EOCs. And I said, well, you know, we would love to have an EOC. We estimate that it's going to take $3 million to build one. We'd appreciate it tremendously if you could step up. He said, his people said, no, we want to do all three. So they said, but we need just a little bit of information. Where'd the $3 million come from? And so I spent the weekend working with CDC, pulling numbers together. By Tuesday, they'd approved $9 million. By 3 weeks later, CDC said, we actually need bigger buildings. There are so many people responding that we need to step up. And so I had kind of suck it up and call Paul Allen's people back and say, you know, I know I said that it was going to be $9 million to build 3 EOCs. We now know they need to be bigger meeting rooms, more computers. It's going to be $3.9 million. All right, so the total is jumping from 9 to 12.9. And so, you know, do you want to just fund 2 and we'll go find money for a third, or do you want to do it all? They came back within 2 days and said, we'll do the 12.9. And it's been an iterative process ever since. In January, 4 months later, they said, could you now tell us, based on what you know, could you write us a proposal, kind of build it in retrospect, now that you know a little bit more about what the budget would be. So we've kind of reverse engineered the gift, but that money's gone to do great things. There are hundreds of stories I could tell you. I went over in January with Pierce and some other staff to see how our money was being spent. And everywhere we went, we were welcomed. The president of Sierra Leone, we didn't ask to meet with these people. They asked to meet with us. President of Sierra Leone met with us and said simply there would not have been the success there was without the CDC Foundation and its donors and without CDC. Every U.S. ambassador asked to meet with us. And they said, your money is buying the entire United States government credibility in this crisis, because CDC and the U.S. government had very little presence. CDC had no presence in any of these countries when they went in. And there was WHO, Doctors Without Borders, other countries, other ministries of health, the African Union, all sitting around a table throwing out ideas. But with the $56 million that we ended up raising in a matter of a couple months to help in this fight, CDC could go to the table every morning at the emergency operations centers and say, here's what we think ought to be done, and we've got the money to do it. And we worked with a not-for-profit there to develop the ability to bank money and spend money quickly. And CDC was doing many things. They were worried about border health, tracking the disease, training people how to protect themselves from the disease, building up laboratory capacity to test, assuring proper burials. And all of that took money. We airlifted in 200 vehicles with the logistics help of United Parcel Service that had been a partner of ours forever. We estimate there were 1,000 emails that went back and forth between us and UPS and Toyota in Belgium, where they were, with shipping companies and airline companies to get those vehicles in. Then they had to be licensed, fueled, maintained, driven, insured. And so we did that. We bought generators. We bought computers. We hired all kinds of staff. And we did it with an unbelievable amount of speed. We set up a call center, a 911 call center, first one ever in the country of Guinea. And the lady doing it, working with this nonprofit partner of ours, was the wife of the deputy chief of mission who worked for the U.S. ambassador's office. And she said she found the space, hired more than 100 staff, bought a generator, bought the computers, installed the software, and started the call center which was handling 10,000 calls a week in 10 days. So that's the speed with which we were able to move. And I will end by telling one story about that I think exemplifies what we were able to do with CDC's leadership and money and partnerships from the private sector. There was a point in time in Sierra Leone where the most people were dying, and there was a section in western Sierra Leone that was a particularly dangerous place. Hundreds of people dying every week. And CDC really was at their wits' end on what to do next. In the end, they came up with a plan on a Thursday afternoon and said, look, we already know there's a team going into this western Sierra Leone on Sunday. And if we could tie in with that team that was more focused on some things like malaria, they were doing some door-to-door work. If we could tie in with that team, if we had 500 staff hired and trained between Thursday afternoon and Sunday, and they could go in with those teams, we think we could beat back Ebola. And so they sent us an email at about noon on a Thursday. We had been talking with a woman who'd made a small gift from up in the Northeast who said, I'd like to do something that I could wrap my head and heart around. So when we got this call for, I think they were asking for about $240,000. Eventually we put in $500,000, but they were asking for about $240,000. We connected with this woman. We said, you've seen a little bit of what we can do. We have this terrible need. We need to act immediately. She said, I'll do it. And within 2 hours, we emailed CDC back and said, go for it. And we had our nonprofit contractor find those hundreds of staff and get them on board. And in February, I ran into one of the top CDC people who had been there at the time. And he said, Charlie, I just have to tell you, I was there helping lead the response to the Sierra Leone Western surge, they called it. And he said, when we sent that request in, it was really a shot in the dark. We really didn't expect to hear much back. And he said, when you came back 2 hours later with a yes, it blew our mind. People got energized. We hired the staff. They went into the Western District on Sunday, and he said, in my opinion, and this is a physician who grew up in Sierra Leone and is back there as one of the CDC country leads now, he said that turned the tide. That single action was a key factor in turning the tide with Ebola in West Africa. So lots of lessons learned there and learned over my 20 years at the CDC Foundation. But the biggest is we need public-private partnerships now more than ever to empower government when its government needs to take the lead, to strengthen the capacity for the for-profit sector to make a difference because they really want to engage. They just need to know how. And so it's been a great career for me. I announced my retirement in April. Sooner or later, they're going to find somebody to replace me, but I've had tremendous mentors, unbelievable opportunity to work on some really big problems. And Ebola's certainly been the biggest. And the opportunity to work in service to a great organization like CDC and with great staff at the CDC Foundation, and there are a few of you in the room today. But those staff are the reason we've been as successful as we are. I'd like to end with just a short video that we put together to say thanks to our donors after Ebola. And then I'd be happy to take questions. So if you can key up that video.
The outbreak in Africa is even worse than we feared.
Medical teams are scrambling to contain a deadly outbreak.
More resources.
The virus does continue to march relentlessly across
West Africa. Ebola is now an epidemic.
1.6 million people now in the grip of Ebola.
More than 1,400 lives already lost.
I've never seen the kind of devastation I saw in Liberia and Sierra Leone over the fall.
There were not enough beds in the hospital. There were literally bodies in the streets. The burial teams were not functional yet.
As the Ebola epidemic exploded, I think the world looked to CDC to be a leader in West Africa.
Things were getting worse faster than anyone could imagine, and the CDC Foundation enabled CDC to accelerate our response.
After we activated our Global Disaster Response Fund, we helped CDC in so many different ways. Generators and computers and internet connections, hiring of staff. We provided vehicles.
We are really pleased to work with the CDC and the CDC Foundation to fund 3 emergency operations centers in the countries that were hardest hit by Ebola. We wouldn't have known of this vital need and been able to partner with these groups to do that if it hadn't been for the CDC Foundation.
Initially, when CDC went into Sierra Leone, the whole communication around Ebola was very disjunctured and confusing to the public. We needed to work with the journalists and the radio announcers in Sierra Leone to come up with a unified messaging on Ebola. The flexible funding opportunity that the CDC Foundation provided set that catalyst in motion.
In Liberia, in response to the Ebola epidemic, CDC Foundation resources, coupled with CDC epidemiologists in the field, were able to quickly isolate and contain those chains of transmission before they took off and caused a wider outbreak.
People were worried that without a vaccine, we might not be able to end the epidemic. Even for planning, money is needed. Before the CDC got resources to support an Ebola vaccine trial, the CDC Foundation was there.
The CDC Foundation has demonstrated time and time again that they can do what is absolutely essential when you're facing a public health crisis. That is, work flexibly, quickly, to make decisions and get resources and people on the ground where they're needed most.
We would not be at the point that we are in the 3 countries during this Ebola outbreak if it had not been for the CDC Foundation and the donors.
We're only able to do what our donors will support. And in this case, they provided the only means for us to be able to really help CDC respond quickly.
In the government, we have unique capacities, but also limitations, and the same is true for the private sector and the philanthropic sector. Working together, we can do so much more than any one of us can do alone.
So that's our story. I'd be happy to take some questions.
Let me ask that you wait for the microphone because this is being broadcast back there.
Good morning. My name is Erica Gwynn, and I represent Westlake High School in South Fulton, Atlanta. My question is, I saw at the end of the video you stated where you could find your donor recognition of who contributed to the campaign, but do you have to cultivate and do like some type of donor moves management process similar to what grassroots nonprofit organizations have to do?
You know, we don't have the typical fundraiser events that because CDC is such an international organization. We really had to, over time, just build up our brand, so to speak, and build trust in the fact that we could make things happen. And that was a 20-year process. It's an ongoing process to convince donors. You know, I didn't talk about it, but when we talked about developing that phrase, doing more faster, that was a culmination of years of chipping away at who we were and what our job was. Very early on, we worked with Bernie Marcus and Oz Nelson and several of our philanthropic board members to craft what we called a short elevator speech to say what we do. And we still have the handwritten flip chart document framed in our offices. And I think it says the CDC Foundation builds public-private partnerships, effective partnerships that enhances CDC's ability to improve health for all, essentially. But it's a mouthful, right? And so our second board chair, Maggie Mahoney, was the grand dame of philanthropy At the time, she'd been a founding staff member for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, staffer at the Carnegie Corporation, and then ran the Milbank Fund in New York. Very bright woman, and when she left the chairmanship, she was also very terse and very focused. And one of the last things she said as she left the board was, you know, I've kind of watched what you do, and I think that what the foundation does is you help CDC do more faster. And that condensed this complicated sentence down to a phrase that Dr. Frieden uses, that new board members immediately understand. And it has become our brand. And what our job has been over the years was to use the gifts we got over time, and they've grown from, you know, $1 million or $2 million in our first year of existence to $150 million last year, 56 for Ebola and $100 million for many other projects. But it's the stewardship of those monies, spending them well with CDC's leadership, reporting back to donors, a tedious task. But over time, that's how we've kind of built up a sense of trust that led to the quick action and the quick donors that stepped up, either because they knew us or because somebody they trusted knew us and made gifts. Other questions?
Does the CDC see another disease or epidemic on the horizon, and you know, what are the plans to fight?
You know, when people ask Dr. Frieden what keeps them up at night, that's one of the big issues. It's a combination of the fact that over the last 30 years, CDC has on average discovered one new contagious disease every year of those 30 years. 30 brand new diseases nobody knew anything about. And in the last 2 years, they've sent scientists out to respond to outbreaks 750 times. So if Ebola had been transmissible through the air, we would have had, you know, a 1918 style global pandemic that would have killed millions in the way it did in 1918. So yeah, there are a lot of things circulating out there, and anytime I want to lose sleep at night, I just sit down with the CDC scientists and ask them what are the latest things they're looking at. Other questions?
So part of our news cycle, all we heard about last fall for a couple of weeks was Ebola, and then it dropped off the radar. What were some of the lessons learned? What were some of the developments realized? There was a mention in the video of a potential Ebola vaccine. I remember hearing about some of the new treatments that were experimental. What were some of the benefits that came out of this horrible experience?
So I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to talk mostly about operational lessons learned, but I will say that you know, over the course of treating so many Ebola victims, that I think the medical community really realized so much of it was about you know, maintaining body fluids that were being lost at such rapid rates. And once they figured that out, they certainly made a dent in treating it. There are several promising vaccine treatments, so I think there's possibilities for success there. But some of the operational lessons learned were, I think, that CDC now knows that while they've been working for years, really behind the scenes, kind of almost robbing Peter to pay Paul to build up some capacity in other countries, they now know that, and Congress agrees, that CDC has got to, and the world's got to build up some capacity in countries where these diseases are emerging, particularly, to leave in those countries the capacity, the laboratory capacity, the disease detective capacity to detect when a disease is happening and get on top of it early. And Congress has funded CDC in a major way to do that in 30 countries over the next several years. So it's happening. But that's a key lesson learned. And for us as an organization, I'd say the biggest is this is the first time we had to marshal a lot of money in another country. And we didn't have the capacity to create a bank account in Sierra Leone or Liberia. We had to find a nonprofit partner in the country that we could rely on, that had a track record of being able to make things happen. And we were lucky in West Africa because we hooked up with an organization called eHealth that had been funded by the Gates Foundation to very successfully build emergency operations centers in Nigeria. That actually helped Nigeria beat back Ebola when it hit that country. And so they've volunteered to move into these other West African countries and set up. But the take home is, if this happened in South America tomorrow, we need partners. Again, we need to be building relationships, and we've started to do that. We had meetings with MAP International here in Atlanta last week, and we've talked to the Carter Center. We've talked to other organizations, the World Lung Foundation, people that have infrastructure in place in developing countries where CDC may not exist at the time. And I think we'll be better prepared next time around.
It seems as of late, you hear a lot of people talk about how evil the U.S. is and this and that, but would you agree that, I mean, Americans do just tremendous work all over the world, and this is proof right here?
Absolutely. You know, and they're not always appreciated for it, but my board chair until recently was the senior vice president for Becton Dickinson, Gary Cohen, just a tremendously giving individual of his personal wealth, and also BD frees him to be heavily engaged in major public health work all over the world. And his mantra every time he would come to a board meeting was to say, when I go into these countries in these really undeveloped areas, all they can do is say thank you for CDC and everything that CDC is doing. And you've got the Carter Center fighting, almost eradicating guinea worm around the world with private donations. Pharmaceutical companies stepping up and offering free, in perpetuity, their drugs that fight river blindness. So, yeah, we're a tremendously giving country. And you really saw it play out in amazing ways in West Africa.
You mentioned your retirement, so what is next for Charlie Stokes?
You know, that's hard. I was just talking with Brantley about that because he retired a couple of years ago, but I don't know. I have all three of my wife's and our sons live in Brooklyn, and 2 granddaughters are there, and there are more coming, I think, boys or girls. And so that's a big draw for us. But all of my board members who have retired have said, in terms of your volunteer work, what you decide to do in your retirement, don't make any of those decisions for the first year. And so I've got a lot of things to catch up on, a lot of things I've set aside that I want to do during that first year. And I think things will fall in place. The big question for me is, what's going to fill the hole that of satisfaction that doing what I've done for the last 20 years has given me? And that's going to be hard to do. So that's going to be my challenge.
Morning.
Hi.
My question is relates to, I guess, current events. I would say that the greatest contagion affecting the world today is violence. And I know the CDC in the past has been involved in to some extent in terms of mental health and the contagion or the plague of violence in the world. What is the CDC's involvement in terms of leadership in addressing that issue? I know some of it's probably
it's probably very indirect in terms of ISIS. But again, I would say I will say CDC has built up multiple centers over time. They started with communicable disease when communicable disease was the #1 killer in this country. But with pharmaceuticals and vaccines, the #1 killers now are injuries in certain populations, young black African men. Gun violence is a major issue for that population. And for many others, it's heart cancer and stroke. And so they've moved into a chronic disease and trying to control chronic diseases. So they are studying certain aspects of intentional violence and unintended violence. So, for example, their data was very instrumental in putting in place the seatbelt laws because they were able to show statistically that people who were in accidents and wearing seatbelts tended to live, and those who weren't died. And that data led to passing some sensitive legislation. In terms of some of the violence going on globally, I'd say CDC's biggest role is coming into countries and building up infrastructures to do what they do so well, building up disease detectives and laboratory work. And health is such a driver of economies. If you've got a population that's ill and people dying young and always sick, that affects everything. And so most of these developing countries don't have the capacity that CDC has, but as they go in, as the guy from Paho said, they're always welcome. They go in without, they're not flying the flag high. They're very understated. They're there to improve health, and they know those ministers of health are there to do the same thing. There's not politics, it's science. And I think as they build that up, that's one of several legs of a stool that are going to lift these countries out of the kinds of situations that lead angry young men with no hope to move to violence as the only answer.
The CDC has grown tremendously. I watched this village go up from my office, and I have a doctor at the Emory Clinic on Clifton, and I tell them I'll take an appointment anytime except rush hour in front of the CDC. Can you give us some statistics on what's happened during your tenure?
In terms of CDC?
The number of employees, the number of buildings, it seems that
So,
it's incredibly large.
So I don't know how many CDC employees there were when I started in '95. I can tell you that right now there are about anywhere from 10 to 12,000 combination of CDC employees and contractors, full-time contractors who look and act like employees but are hired through contracting mechanisms. And their mission has grown, and it's always been global. But as I said, there's a congressional, I think, appreciation for the importance of what CDC does after issues like Ebola. In terms of their buildings, they needed a major overhaul when I came. And Congress, I think, over time understood that. And between 1990 and 2000, really poured major funding in to rebuild that campus. There's no doubt it's created a traffic issue between Emory and CDC. It's not a happy place to be during morning and evening rush hour. I would also say, and I didn't stress this a lot, but one of the reasons I think we're so important is while CDC has grown, I would say they're underappreciated in the appropriation process. They suffer more. They're in the last 7 or 8 years through the recession, and still their core appropriation for their core staff has essentially they've lost ground more than they've gained it. And when they do their job well, nobody knows they're there. If they fail, then it's a big deal. I had a director of the Department of Natural Resources in Missouri one time say, and he built up his organization very well, and I didn't appreciate his philosophy, but it worked. He said, All I do is I figure out where we need money, and I create a crisis, and the legislature stops in and gives us all the money we need to, and CDC would never do that. But their portion of the federal budget, at least the last time I did the math, was about 1/10,000th of our tax dollar goes to fund the CDC. So we need all the public-private partnerships to empower them that we can get. And the faster they can build up capacity around the world, the better off we'll all be here in this country.
Maybe one more question? Okay.
No more
Charlie,
questions?
thank you very much.
Thanks
for
for
your
having
comments. Charlie, I'd like to present you with this sculpture done by Loretta Eby. We give to all of our speakers in recognition for speaking to us today. So thank you very
Fantastic.
much.
Thank you. It was an honor.
Yeah, thank you. And good luck in your retirement.
Thank you.
That completes Terry Third Thursday today. Remember to get your parking ticket validated before you leave, and you can get out of the parking lot. Let me wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. We'll see y'all in January. Bye-bye.